Member Bransky,
Here.
Member Cap,
Here.
Member Panera, Member O'Brien,
Here.
Member Johnson,
Here.
Member Vega.
Here. Good evening. This is the second of 4 public meetings to specifically discuss the updates to the zoning code that we've been working on. The next meeting is going to be scheduled for January 27th at 7 p.m. And you will all be notified of that once the date gets closer. So we're going to have a presentation by our consultants. And then the board's going to discuss different things, and then we'll open it up to the public. And anybody that has a question or comment, we'll give you 3 minutes to talk, and then we're going to ask you to state your name, and if you don't want to give us your address, just the community you live in. So we'll get started with our presentation from our consultants.
Thank you all so much for having us back again this evening. We're very excited to be presenting our diagnostic report and preliminary recommendations frameworks. This is really the first step after getting all the feedback from you all at the beginning of the process about the issue for the existing code, and really turning that around into recommendations for how we can update the code moving forward. So for tonight's meeting, we're going to go through some of the same slides that we went through during the first meeting, since we have some new folks in the audience. So introducing ourselves, going over the purpose and goals of the zoning code update, the project scope and schedule, and then what we've heard about outreach to date, and then do a report overview and then Q&A. So like you all had said, we're with House of Levine Associates, the consultant firm that's been engaged to help the city or help the village go through this zoning ordinance update. So I'm Jackie Wells, the project manager, and I'm joined by Ruben Shell, who's the lead support on the project. So why is the village updating its zoning code? So first, it's really to modernize the code and improve the user friendliness and help to simplify processes. To update uses that are obsolete, unclear, or missing, update the permitted uses by district to ensure that what's allowed in each district is really what we want to see in those areas of the community, modernize terminology and definitions, especially those that are obsolete, and ensure that we have definitions for all the terms that are necessary. We want to remove inconsistencies with best practices and trends, and ensure compliance with every federal, state, and local legislation. So this project has 4 steps. So we are in step 2, diagnostic report and preliminary recommendations framework. So after this evening, after we get your feedback on our recommendations, we'll be moving into step 3, the draft zoning code sections and review meetings. So we'll be delivering the draft zoning code in sections so that staff is able to review everything. You all are able to review everything in a manner that isn't overwhelming. So you don't have the whole zoning code in front of you, and you don't know which end is up. So those iterative deliverables really help to ensure a high level of review going forward. And then we get into step 4, where all of those zoning code sections are compiled together, all the revisions are made. We introduce graphics and other visuals to help illustrate and clarify interpretation of the regulations, and then we'll go through the adoption process. Well, all in all, we have really about a 12 to 18 month schedule to get all of this accomplished. So we are here in September at the Planning and Zoning Commission Public Workshop. And as you said, we'll be doing another workshop towards the end of January with the first half of the code. So we've done quite a bit of outreach so far. There are several ways to get involved, primarily on the village's website. So there's an online questionnaire. We have a map.social, which is an interactive mapping tool where you can create your own map of the village. People are able to drop off written comments or email comments to the village as well. So we did have a first workshop with you all several months back now to go over the initial policy direction memo. So we have that summarized and up on the website. But through that workshop, we did get a lot of clear direction from you all and also from the public on the policy direction that we want to go to, that we want to reflect in our code moving forward. We've also heard quite a bit from the community through our online questionnaire. So far we have received about 180 total responses. That was as of, I think, Wednesday of this week, so it might be even more now. From what we've heard, more than 50% of respondents think the code needs to better address noise, lighting, traffic, commercial vehicle parking, especially for industrial or business parks, and employment uses as they relate to single-family residential homes. Then more than 50% of respondents said we should have enhanced standards for related to the exterior appearance of several uses, including mainly commercial and industrial uses. More than 50% of respondents also said that new development moving forward should have improved standards as well, especially for landscaping, their parking lots, the exterior appearance of the buildings, as well as pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure. More than 50% of respondents also thought the village should require various sustainable features, environmentally friendly standards, so permeable surfaces, bicycle pedestrian infrastructure, rain gardens, bioswales, etc. And then the village should encourage green roofs rather than require them. So this is a visual of the map, the crowdsourced map of points of the village. So if you were to go onto map.social page, you could click on each of these points and read the comments of the individuals who had made, who would drop the points on the map. So whether that's about buffering and screening that's needed, or if there's a public safety concern, we see a trend of these types of comments in the community, and that'll help to inform, especially our district-specific standards. All right, so now we're going to get into our report overview, unless there's any questions about the process or the outreach we've conducted so far.
Anybody have any questions or comments for right now?
We will jump right in. So the diagnostic report and the preliminary recommendations is really broken up into two parts. So first, the proposed structure for the zoning ordinance moving forward, and then we supply our preliminary recommendations based on that proposed structure. So starting with our proposed structure, we're recommending a 9-article organization of the code, starting off with the most broad information and then getting more and more specific as we get deeper into the code. This really helps create an intuitive and more streamlined organization so that someone who's going through, they first read about the purpose and intent of their district, then they get into the uses they're allowed to do, and the local conventional standards they would be applied to their parcel in Article 3. Then if they have any use-specific standards that they would need to apply for the use that they're thinking about doing, they would get that in Article 4. Then in Article 5, we have development standards. That would be parking and landscaping, fences, all of those things that would be applicable across the village, regardless of the district. And then we get into our more procedural sections. So Article 6, plan development standards and procedures. Article 7, zoning procedures. And then the more technical sections, the nonconformities and definitions. So overall, we have several recommendations that will apply to all the zoning code sections and articles. So first, eliminating legalese and jargon wherever possible, making it so that a resident, a business owner can pick up the code and understand it. They don't have to go to Angela or go to an attorney to really understand what the regulations are saying. We want to eliminate redundancy. We know in a code that's been amended over time that there could be sections that contradict one another or that are redundant, and we want to ensure that we eliminate all of those instances. We also want to include graphics and diagrams to really, again, help the code be more user-friendly, but then also to clarify interpretation. So by having the regulations not only written, but also visualized, it helps to ensure that everyone is interpreting the language in the same way. So moving into our recommendations by our proposed article structure. So Article 1, we're proposing to include the existing zoning ordinance sections that establish title, intent, purpose, applicability, all of the things that you really need to set up the defensibility of the code moving forward. And then we're proposing that all of the definitions that are currently in this section of the code be moved all the way to Article 9, so that you don't have to go through all of these definitions that you might not be required or necessary for your interpretation of the code. So really have that as more of an index, a reference item in the back. Then we get into Article 2, the establishment of districts. We have quite a few recommendations for this one. So we would recommend that the purpose and intent statements for all of the village's zoning districts be established right up front in this article. And then we want to look at updating the purpose and intent statements for each district to ensure that they're more descriptive, not only about the types of uses, the desired character of the area, but also about the development pattern. So wanting to ensure that we describe the density range and the development intensity that we're looking for in a specific area, the predominant land use type, whether that be commercial or residential, distinguishing features. So why is the R1 district different than the R2 district? How does that development look visually different? We also want to update the purpose and intent statements of the business districts to clarify that those districts are for the generation of property tax revenue, and then also for the protection from the encroachment of non-taxable bodies. And this is to address concerns about the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. So that is an act that was a federal legislation that came down in the late 90s that made it difficult for protected religious land uses from being excluded from communities. So in order to comply with that law, we have to very clearly regulate places of worship in the same way we would regulate other institutions, so other non-taxable bodies. So we want to be very clear that our business districts are for those taxable bodies and that our other areas are for those non-commercial places of assembly. We're also proposing that the village eliminate the downtown overlay district. Overlay districts can provide just another level of regulation, another level of complexity that can inhibit reinvestment or redevelopment in an area. And we don't really see anything that would benefit from the overlay district that we couldn't accomplish in revisions to the base district. So to that end, we're proposing that the B1 district, the boundaries of the district, be adjusted to capture the downtown core more accurately. So we can have regulations that apply to the downtown core to that very specific development pattern that we want to see there, and have that reflected in the regulations, and not apply to areas that really don't have that similar development pattern. We're also recommending, again, to comply with the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. The acronym for that is RLUIPA. So I'm going to say that because the other way is just a mouthful. So it's to rezone those non-commercial places of assembly to residential or to your PL districts so that they don't become non-conforming uses going forward. Moving into Article 3, the district standards. So we're proposing that this article include tables for the uses that are allowed in each district. So you have one table with all of the different uses and then all of the districts, and it would indicate whether it's a permitted use, a special use, or whether it's not allowed. And similarly, you would have one table for all the bulk dimensional standards. We are also recommending that the village establish limited uses. So these would be uses that warrant an additional level of review, but they don't warrant a special use, right? They're sort of in the middle ground that they can be approved administratively, but then the administrator would also have the ability to elevate that limited use to a special use if they deem it necessary to have that additional level of review. So getting again into the RLUIPA issues, so the non-commercial place of assembly versus the commercial place of assembly, this is really how we're distinguishing between and complying with those RLUIPA requirements. So establishing these new uses, so this would capture some of your existing uses. Learning centers is one of them. Some of your more specific institutional uses would all be compiled either into non-commercial place of assembly or commercial place of assembly uses. And the definitions are here on the screen, but the main words are operated not for profit and operated for profit. So these are the types of uses, the learning centers and some of the other recreation or assembly uses that the village has. We're proposing be included in these commercial and non-commercial place of assembly uses. So to further regulate or distinguish between commercial places of assembly, we're recommending that that use group be broken down into indoor and outdoor places of assembly, and then also differentiated by their scale. So for indoor, whether that's less than 5,000 square feet or greater than or equal to 5,000 square feet, and for outdoor, whether it's less than 10,000 square feet or greater than or equal to 10,000 square feet. And this is to ensure that we have standards in place to help minimize the impacts of these types of uses. And the scale of the use can really have a big, plays a big part in how impactful the use can be externally. Next, moving into personal service and professional office uses. You'll remember from the initial policy direction memo, this was a concern that there was sort of a proliferation of spa and salon establishments and in medical offices. So to address that, we're proposing that the salon and spa establishment be consolidated into the personal service use category. And then we update and clarify the definitions for the personal service and professional office uses to ensure that it is very clear what does and does not fall into those categories. And then in the B1 district, in your downtown district, we're recommending that we differentiate between those uses that are located above the ground floor and the uses that are located on the ground floor. Trying to encourage ground floor uses in the B1 district to be the types of uses that really generate a lot of foot traffic, that contribute to the vibrancy of the area. So looking at allowing those as a limited use, that would be something that would be approved administratively, but would have an additional level of review that would be required. And then if they're located above the ground floor, have that be a permitted use. So trying to incentivize their location above the ground floor instead of on the ground floor. Moving into short-term rentals, this is another topic that we had discussed in our initial policy direction memo. So looking at establishing a new use category for short-term rentals, and then establishing some use specific standards, which we'll get into more as we talk about Article 5. But we have, we're proposing that the short-term rental be permitted in all of your single-family residential districts. Then moving into accessory dwelling units. So this was one topic that I think we received some pretty mixed feedback on whether we did or did not want to allow accessory dwelling units. So we really want to encourage you to discuss this further after we go over what we are proposing those use specific standards would be. So the standards that would apply to the accessory dwelling units, after hearing those, perhaps that could further inform your opinion or decision on whether accessory dwelling units are appropriate in the village. So next, the 2 and 3 flats in single family residential districts. So these are those existing 2 and 3 flats that homeowners are having a difficult time either purchasing or reinvesting in because they are considered non-conforming. So it makes it very difficult to get a mortgage or any type of funding to reinvest in these properties. So in order to allow that to happen, we're proposing that we distinguish between 2-family dwellings and multiple family dwellings that are existing at the time of the adoption of the code and those that are newly built. So if they are existing at the time of the adoption of the code, they would be allowed to continue. We would have specific standards to ensure that their density isn't increased. If you have a 2 flat, that's not becoming a 3 flat or a 4 flat, it's staying a 2 flat. But we want to ensure that people have the ability to reinvest in their properties so that we don't see a decline and deterioration over time. So next we're looking at co-working spaces. So we want to establish a new use category about co-working spaces, making it very clear the types of uses that would be allowed to go into a co-working space and having that be very clearly defined so we don't have uses moving into those spaces that really aren't allowed or permitted in the district. So ensuring that we have a permitting process so the village can verify that. Next are impervious surface limits. So this is a recommendation that is really to further the village's environmental goals. So looking to establish impervious surface maximums for your non-residential districts. You currently have these maximums for your residential districts. So we want to look at establishing those for your non-residential areas as well. And you can see on here on the screen what those proposed maximums would be. So next we did a lot area and width appropriateness analysis. Mouthful, but it compares the requirements for lot area and lot width that are in your code currently with the development that you have on the ground, to see whether it really is reflective if your regulations are capturing that existing development. So it identifies parcels that are non-conforming with your existing standards, and then tests alternatives in order to minimize the level of non-conformity. But then to ensure that lowering or minimizing those lot area and width minimums isn't going to change the character of neighborhoods that are already established by creating new opportunities for subdivision, we test for those opportunities to ensure that those are minimized over time. So first we looked at the R1 district, and with your existing 10,400 square foot lot area minimum, 39.2% of parcels were non-conforming. And with the existing 80-foot lot width minimum, 63.3% of parcels were not conforming. So that's quite a bit. So that can make it really difficult for homeowners in the R1 district to reinvest in their properties, build additions, and make those homes more livable going forward. So we tested some alternatives to see what would be more appropriate. So we brought it down to a 9,000 square foot lot area minimum. That brought the non-conformity level down to 18.3%. And then with the 8,500 square foot minimum, it brought down to 12.1%. Typically about a 10% level of non-conformity is seen as sort of the right amount. You can't accommodate everything, but you want to ensure you get bring that down as much as possible. And then for the lot width minimums, we looked at 70, 60, and 50 feet, and we were able to bring that down to 58.6, 40.4, and 19.5. So then, based on these alternative standards, we tested opportunities for subdivision to ensure that by lowering those standards, we weren't going to really alter the character of neighborhoods. So that found that by lowering it to 9,000 square feet and a 60-foot lot width, then we would have 18 new opportunities for subdivision. But if we brought it all the way down to 8,500 square feet and the 50-foot lot width minimum, you have 56 new opportunities for subdivision, which is quite a bit. So based on that, our recommendation is to lower the lot area and width minimums for the R1 district to 9,000 square feet and then the 60-foot lot width. We did a very similar analysis in the R2 district. So the existing level of nonconformity was 47.7% for the lot area and 54% for lot width. So we tested these new minimums and as well as tested their new opportunities for subdivision. And we found that if we bring it down to 7,500 for the lot area and 50 for the lot width, we have 46 new opportunities for subdivision, 7,050, 55, 6,500, and 45, we have 89. So those seem really high, right? But if we look at the 7,500 square foot lot area and the 50-foot lot width minimum, of those 46 new opportunities for subdivision, there are really only 5 with the potential to alter the character. So if you take a look at the map that's included at the end of the memo, you can see that the majority of those new opportunities for subdivision are double lots. So they're double the width, they're double the area of the other lots that are surrounding it. So when you cut those out, when you cut out the ones that if they were to subdivide would really be reflective of the size and area of the neighboring lots, there are only 5 potential that would alter the character of the neighborhood. So because of that, we are proposing that the R2 district be reduced to 7,500 square feet and the 50-foot lot width. So moving into the R3 district, so we found that the existing 4,300 square foot per dwelling unit lot area minimum requirement works really well for the community. There are only 4 parcels that are non-conforming, so we have a great rate of 9.3%. So we're not proposing any changes to the existing lot area minimum. When you look at the lot width minimum, that's where you see it gets a little more tricky. So at the existing 60-foot, we have about 69% non-conformity. So we tested alternatives. So at the 50-foot, it brings it down to 39%, and then 45 brings it down to 6.9%. So when we look at the new opportunities for subdivision, the 50-foot lot width minimum would create no new opportunities for subdivision, and the 45-foot would only create one new opportunity for subdivision. So with that, we are proposing that we bring it down to that lowest level, really minimize the level of nonconformity overall. So we have the 4,300 square foot lot area per dwelling unit and the 45-foot lot width. Moving into Article 4, the use standards. We are proposing that your existing use standards, many of them be carried forward, could just be modernized to ensure that they are not including any kind of new trends in development. We also want to ensure compliance with federal and state regulations, again, not really the issue. So there are currently standards for places of worship in the code. So we want to ensure that if we carry those forward, they apply to all of the non-commercial places of assembly. We also want to establish new use standards for short-term rentals and accessory dwelling units. So for short-term rentals, we're proposing that the village restrict the maximum number of guests, establish a minimum and maximum duration of stay for the guests, restrict the maximum number of operations in a calendar year, and require that the site have the owner occupied so that the owner of the property live on the site as their primary residence. And that's really to ensure that you don't have any maintenance issues or other types of concerns from neighbors. So moving into the accessory dwelling unit standards, since the village was sort of unsure whether accessory dwelling units were appropriate in the community, we did research on some other Northeast Illinois communities, South Elgin, Park Forest, and Wilmette, to see how those communities allow accessory dwelling units, to see how those might be appropriate standards to also consider for Homewood. So we find that South Elgin allows accessory dwelling units as a permitted use, but also requires a site plan review by the planning commission. Park Forest, they are allowed sort of as that limited type of use, so they require a review and approved by the zoning administrator. And then in Wilmette, they are a special use. South Elgin, so you can really see South Elgin is sort of the most, they allow it most broadly, and Wilmette allows it, but it's in the most restrictive way. So South Elgin, you can have it anywhere within the principal structure and then also in an accessory structure in the rear yard. Park Forest, you can have it within the principal structure or an attached garage, not in a detached accessory structure. And then in Wilmette, you can only have it within the principal structure. No, you're not allowed to have it in the accessory structure. For the number, all of the communities only allow one accessory dwelling unit per lot. For the allowable size, some base that on the size of the lot, so a percentage of the lot or percentage of the principal dwelling unit, and then Elgin has that at just a flat 900 square feet. For occupancy, Park Forest and Wilmette have standards to require that the property owner either live in the accessory dwelling unit or the principal dwelling unit. And then for the design, the requirement at South Elgin is to have the, if it's a detached structure, to have that be architecturally very similar to the principal structure. So you don't see that really as something different on the lot. It really conforms to the design of the property overall. So based on our research and based on the standards that we've written for other communities, these are the standards that we're proposing that Home would consider if it wants to allow accessory dwelling units moving forward. So first, limiting one accessory dwelling unit per lot. Have them be allowed as of right if it's located internal to the principal dwelling unit. Require a special use permit if it's located in an accessory building. If it's located in an accessory building, allow the entrance are allowed to only be to the interior side or rear of the principal building, just like you would allow a detached garage. Require that the property owner live on site, and then limit the maximum size of the, if it's located in an accessory building, to a percentage of the lot or 900 square feet, whichever is less. And then if it's located internally, having be a percentage of the floor area of the principal dwelling. So you're ensuring that it's proportional to the lot or to the building and maintaining that accessory aspect of the use. not allowing an additional driveway, so still allowing only one driveway to serve both uses, so you maintain that single-family residential appearance from the street. And then similar to South Elgin, requiring similar architectural features, so that really it blends in nicely with the architecture of the home. This is just a photo example of an accessory dwelling unit from a community that we've worked in. As you can see it, from the street, you really wouldn't be able to tell that it was anything except a garage. So moving into Article 5, Development Standards. We're proposing a couple of tweaks to some of your existing standards. So first, for change in use and intensity of use, the village currently requires a new use moving into an existing building to meet the parking requirements for that use, not necessarily the parking that's already been established. And that can be really tricky if you have a new use moving into an existing building where the site really can't accommodate any additional parking. So it can really inhibit reinvestment in new business development. So we're proposing that be waived if the site restricts that additional parking from being constructed. If they have all the area in the world and they can build that additional parking, we don't want to allow them to waiver those requirements. If there really isn't any space on the site to accommodate that, having some flexibility there can really help reinvestment in existing areas. Moving into shared parking, this is something that the village currently allows, but it does not allow a reduction in the amount of parking cumulatively that the two uses that share the parking would have. So we're recommending that if the uses have different hours of operation, so if you have a bank that operates during the daytime and a bar or restaurant that operates mainly in the evening, if they want to share parking, then they could cumulatively reduce the overall amount of parking that you're required to establish. And then for your minimum parking requirements, we're proposing that you also establish a maximum parking restriction so that someone couldn't go and pave their entire lot. They can have only so much parking, but understanding that some uses require more parking than others, we're proposing that if they want to exceed that parking maximum, they need to surface that parking with a permeable pavement to ensure we don't have any really negative impacts to the environment. Next, moving into driveways, we are proposing additional standards be established for these three areas that we see on this graphic. So the blue would be the driveways. That would be the portion of the driveway that touches the property line. So we're proposing that would be restricted to a very uniform width so that we don't have overly wide driveways at the lot line. But then recognizing that people have 2-car garages, they have needs to park multiple vehicles. We want to allow a greater width for the garage access drive. So we would taper out to a wider width and allow that pad area to be the width of the width of the garage doors. And then also recognizing that people may have a third vehicle or may have only a 1-car garage, allowing for additional paved area for a parking pad, whether it's next to the garage access drive or next to the garage itself, to allow the additional parking in those areas. And then to ensure that residents have the option to have a more environmentally friendly option when they're developing their driveways, introducing standards for ribbon driveways. So that's the picture here on the bottom screen that just allows for more permeable surface area in the ribbon portion of the driveway. So it's moving into landscape. We're proposing to replace the village's existing standards for landscaping with more specific standards for these 4 areas of a property. So the parking lot perimeter area that's shown in purple on the screen, that would be where a parking lot abuts any right of way. The parking lot interior area, which is of course the parking lot surface area itself, the foundation of buildings, and then the transition area, which would be any zone, any land area next to another use. So if this was a commercial use and right next door to the rear was a residential use, you would require a different level of buffering than you would if it were a commercial use next to another commercial use. Moving into screening, we are also proposing to replace the village's existing standards for screening. So looking at trash and recycling receptacle screening, screening for ground and roof mounted mechanical equipment, loading docks, service areas, and drive-throughs, especially as they really are adjacent to residential areas to ensure that there are no negative impacts to residential neighborhoods from those different components. Next, I'm moving into fences. We're proposing that the standards that are within the zoning code and then the other standards that are in the municipal code all be consolidated into the zoning code so that people don't have different sections of the municipal code to go to and maybe have surprise standards that they have to comply with if they only work in one section or the other. So we're also proposing to introduce general standards for fences in all districts, looking at permitted locations, or how far from the property line they can be located. Can you be located in easement? Can you not be located in easement? Having that be very clearly established. Then also construction standards to ensure that our maintenance of fences going forward. And then looking at fences in our residential areas, we are proposing to restrict fences in front and corner side yards to a maximum height of 4 feet and a maximum opacity of 50%. But then if you are in a, for that corner front yard, if that's, really your rear yard, but you're on a corner lot, so it's kind of tricky. And a lot of people want to have those privacy fences and to better enjoy their backyard. So have an allowance for a maximum height of 6 feet and a 100% opaque fence if it's located a minimum of 6 feet from the property line and is improved with landscaping. And we understand that that's a variance that often comes before you all. It's something that you often require. So just putting that in the code is going to eliminate one more variance. And then we're also proposing to prohibit chain link or wire mesh fence materials. Into Article 6, the plan development standards and procedures. We're proposing that a new pre-development process be established, and it would rely more heavily on the underlying zoning district standards. And if through the plan development process, the developer is requesting deviations from the underlying zoning requirements. So if I'm doing a commercial plan development and I want greater height, that would be considered a site development allowance and would only be considered by the village as a privilege and would have to be in response or in relation to tangible benefits that are provided to the village. And that would be sort of weighed with these very explicit review standards and modification standards. So the review standards would be something that would apply to the plan development as a whole. And modification standards would be more specific benefits to the village that they would have to cite and kind of relate to negotiate that site development allowance for. And one such standard of review or modification standard would be the preservation of open space on the site. And moving into Article 7, zoning procedures. So currently the code has procedures in several different chapters. So we're proposing consolidating all of those into this one article so that you have a one-stop shop for all of your process needs. So we'd start off with general application requirements, who's allowed to file application, who receives them, et cetera. So all of those standard requirements that would apply to all applications that the village receives. Then we would get into administrative review and action procedures, so what can be done by staff. And then the more general requirements for boarding commission review and action procedures. So what are the initial steps that every special use permit variance and text and map amendment has to go through, including all those public notice requirements, having that very clearly spelled out in a table. And then we move into the special use permit standards, variance, text and map amendments, so that we have that process really streamlined and clear for anyone who's considering going through one of those processes. And then we're also recommending that your submittal requirements, the application submittal requirements, as well as the fee requirements be removed from the code and established in standalone documents. So the submittal requirements and the fees, there's something that the village might want to update. And if they're in the code, you have to go through a text amendment process. And that can be really cumbersome if we're just trying to change an application requirement from a DVD to a PDF, right? That doesn't need public comment. That's not something that's really, going to impact development in the village. So having that be something that the village has a little more flexibility in updating would be really beneficial. So next, we're proposing to establish a new process for the subletting of office space and change of use permitting. So this is something that we had discussed during the initial policy document. So looking at establishing a zoning compliance certification procedure. So if a new use is moving into an established or existing structure, they don't comply, the new use moving into the new building wouldn't require a building permit, a certificate of occupancy. It can be kind of tricky to know if that use is allowed in the district. They just move in without any sort of verification from the village. So by establishing this process, we would have that additional level of check review. So that would require applicants just to provide a brief description of the change of the use that they're doing, and then a sketch drawing depicting the change to the building, and the change in floor areas involved. So if we're subletting an office space and 25% of the office is going to go to another use, then we need to see, visually on the site plan sort of what that would look like. Next, we have Article 8, nonconformities. So we really will just carry forward your existing standards for nonconformities. These are really driven by state requirements. There's not a whole lot of tweaking that we can do or would want to do to these standards. We will definitely clean up the language, make it a little easier to understand and be a little more user-friendly in that way, and ensure that we are complying with all the state requirements. But other than that, this is not a section that's going to see a whole lot of change or update. And then lastly, Article 9. So we're proposing all of the definitions that are included throughout the zoning code all be consolidated here, so that people will have the one area to go to, and that we don't have any conflicting or redundant definitions in the code. We want to eliminate unnecessary definitions, modernize outdated definitions, and then ensure that all of the uses in the code have definitions that you all can very clearly understand what is and is not considered a certain use type. We want to ensure that any quantifiable standards or measurements are removed from our definitions. We don't want to have any surprise requirements for use hidden or tucked away in a definition. We want to ensure that those are in the more appropriate, either use-specific standards, development standards, depending on what it is, just so they're very clear and no one is surprised at the end of a process that they're required to do something. If there have any definitions that are only used or in terms that are defined only in reference to another term, we want to eliminate that. Why have the two different ways of saying it? Just use one or the other. I just want to ensure that we have a lot of clarity moving forward. And then if we have definitions that are similar to one another, so for example, rear lot line or front lot line, organizing them together rather than alphabetically. So we have lot line, comma rear, lot line, comma front, so that if you're looking for all the definitions, you don't have to go to 5 different sections of the article to find them. And that is all we had for our overview, and I want to open it up to questions. I know I went through that pretty quickly. I talked fast, I apologize. So if I skimmed over anything, please let me know. I'm happy to go into more detail.
Who on the board would like to start? Any questions or comments?
Mr. Commissioner, are we going to do this section by section and pool all the comments and questions by section? Probably be a lot less confusing for everyone.
Yes.
Okay.
I think
Back to the various slides, that would help trigger any thoughts or questions.
So did you want to start?
Wanna start? Sure.
Go ahead.
Going all the way back to the beginning on the proposed ordinance structure. We got a kind of a question and a comment. In the finished product, will there be a matrix that'll show us how the old sections were moved into the new sections?
Yes,
Okay.
and we actually do have that kind of preliminarily prepared.
Yeah.
But we'll definitely can provide an updated version of that once everything is said.
You
and
want
done.
it's done,
Things
okay.
will probably move around from what we have prepared currently, just as we get into things. Yeah, definitely that's something we can provide.
Okay, because that could be key for looking at historical decisions that were made on a property and looking at how the new set deals with it now. So that would be key.
You're saying it'll be redlined.
So the text itself will be redlined, so we will carry forward, if you have existing standards for landscaping that we're replacing, we will show those crossed out in the new standards in the actual text itself. But we can also provide sort of a crosswalk per se, so the landscaping standards used to be this section, now they're this section, or this was the old standard, and this in the old code, and this is where it's located in the new code.
Anything else, Mr. Bransky?
Not for that section.
Member Cap?
More of a comment. I really like the organization of this. And I think your presentation was very concise, so that was good. So the organization is fun. I didn't, in my packet, I didn't, you made reference to a map. I didn't.
Oh, they were included in the, okay, they included those in the final draft.
It was the last meeting.
I mean, again, we're at stage 2, so it's not that essential, but just,
Well, the maps, they're a sort of a visualization of the
Right.
tables. So they just show where the non-conforming parcels are located. And it really helps in that the R2 example, I believe, to show that the parcels that would be new opportunities for subdivision really are just sort of double lots.
Got it.
So they're 2
Sure.
lots instead of one lot that was the size of 2 lots of their.
so that might anticipate some questions when we get through the next
Yes,
section, so
definitely.
that's
We
fine.
can get
Okay.
those pulled up and I'll have to see if we get to those.
Okay,
I have questions on them.
so at this stage, no further question.
Okay.
Okay.
Member O'Brien?
Good evening. In your comment in the material regarding ADUs, you mentioned on-site and per lot. Could you clarify that?
So the, would it be for the size of the ADU? Is that the standard that you're referring to?
Sorry about the language. I'm trying to distinguish between on-site and per lot.
I'm not quite sure what that language is referring to in the text. But the idea would be to restrict one accessory dwelling unit per parcel and then restrict the size of the accessory dwelling unit based on the size of the lot. So that you don't have a accessory dwelling unit that really is an accessory to the primary dwelling unit or to the lot itself. Does that clarify the question? You can also show me the text if that might help too. That you're looking at.
I'll come back to it. I don't have any other questions at this point.
Member Johnson?
I have some questions regarding Article 6 that we can wait later. Just quickly, if maybe you can expound a little bit on the limited use. I think you talked about for some uses, there might be a need for an additional level of review. Any thoughts about how that would take place and who would be done?
With specific types of uses.
Right.
So that's something we.
No, not, I mean, you did say what you said earlier, what type uses, but if they're with respect to those type uses, who would be doing the additional review?
So that would be done administratively, so that would be Angela and her team, so it'd especially be true for any uses that don't require a special use permit, but might have additional specific standards to ensure that the site plan is accommodating all of those types of uses. So it would really be a site plan review check.
And I guess my next question relates to Article 6. I assume you tell me what it is, Article 6, and that's, you mentioned that there was a concern, the community, not concern, but the feedback from the community. I think you said 180 responses from the community, concerns about noise, lighting, traffic, so on and so forth. Does Article 6 is that the article that's meant to address going forward those kinds of issues, like when we talk about Article 6.
We know the Article 5, the development standards, so those are the standards of the applicable development regardless of the district it's located in. So things like screening, landscaping, all of those types of requirements would help to minimize impacts off-site of certain types of uses. But definitely we have standards throughout the code that would be drive those types of regulations. So we have use-specific standards that could be applied to specific uses. So if we see a specific type of use that is causing more external impacts than others, and we want to curb those, we can establish use-specific standards. The establishment of districts, even those purpose and intent statements, ensuring that it is very clear, like I said, the intensity of the development, the types of uses we want to see, the pattern of development that we're looking for, having that really clearly established in our purpose and intent statements can help to give you all the backing needed to provide those additional conditions on your special use permits or your plan development standards. Any type of discretionary approval, having a really clear purpose and intent statement can help you all have that sort of backing for additional conditions you might place on that development.
No, I just noticed that we had it in Article 6 and planned development standards, preservation of open spaces, which is obviously the
Definitely.
big
So that would
issue
be-
we've had in this community.
For sure. So the plan development process, I think, is a really useful tool for the village to have. It provides that flexibility to allow for more creative design and different types of uses that you just can't anticipate in the zoning code. You can't regulate everything. You can't anticipate every type of development that's going to come forward. So by having that plan development process, by having the flexibility built into the code, the village is able to sort of accommodate specific situations as they come in front of you. But to ensure that there is a fair level of certainty in the types of changes or site development allowances, so the deviations from the underlying zoning district, we want to ensure that there is standards that they would need to meet if they're requesting those deviations. If they want to have smaller lot sizes, taller buildings, anything that would be different than what the zoning code requires, then they need to do something that would be of benefit to the village. And one of those things could be preservation of open space.
Yeah, we had talked about lot sizes and everything like that, not going less than 50 feet wide,
Okay.
for instance. When is all of that going to really be put in place? So that, I mean, right now, we're just talking about a lot of different things. When are some of these things actually going to start with a decision? Okay, are we going to do 50 feet, 55 feet? When is all of that going to happen?
So it's nothing settled, of course, until the zoning code is adopted, but we're hoping tonight to get the direction from you all, whether the proposed standards, the lowered standards, I hate saying lowered, it's not like we're lowering our standard, we're lowering the minimum requirement. So those lowered requirements, whether that's something that is feasible or desirable in the village. The idea is really to bring more properties into conformity. There's not a whole lot of opportunity for new residential development in the village, not a whole lot of land area available for that. So we want to ensure that the development that exists, people are able to reinvest in those properties in a way that is easy to do. They don't have to come in front of you all for a variance. So we're hoping to get that feedback from you all tonight. But if we want to ruminate over and maybe think about it a little bit more, the next meeting that we'll have, we'll be presenting to you all the actual regulations, the draft code language that would be addressing these dimensional standards. So then we'll be asking for your feedback again on those standards. And then we'll be going in front of you again multiple times before we get to the adoption process. So there's always room to edit and change things until the code's adopted.
Okay, because I mean, let's face it, there's not a whole lot of developable lots left in the village of Houma. So if we you know, if we decide 55 feet is the minimum width we want, how does that affect everybody else who's got a 50-foot lot?
Well, exactly. So that would bring more people into non-conformity, a non-conforming status. So by lowering the standards as we're proposing, it would bring more people into that conforming status.
But at the same time, it wouldn't necessarily stop a developer from coming in and saying, okay, well, now that the standards for a lot have been lowered, I can now tear down 2 houses, 1 house and build 2, right?
That would be possible. So that was those new opportunities for subdivision that we were testing. And it wasn't so much to prohibit someone subdividing their lot and building 2 homes, but really to ensure that the character of existing neighborhoods wasn't changed over time. So if we have, very consistent lots that are a certain size at a certain width, we don't want to allow someone to come in and really change that pattern of development.
John, I was only talking about as relates to density. I get your point, absolutely. I think this is good.
Don't we have somewhere in existence a map that shows all the different lots and what the widths are? I recall seeing something like that
I don't know if I've
in the
seen
past.
a map with all the lots, the lot widths defined. We can definitely make that map for you all if you want to see that more specifically. And that is included in the maps that were included at the end of the demo. And unfortunately weren't included in your packet, but we will definitely get those to you. So we can get closer to that.
Because it seems to me there's a lot of areas where the lots were originally 25 feet wide.
Mhm.
So if somebody wanted to build a house, they had to buy 2 lots. And a lot of people, if they wanted a little bit bigger house, they wound up buying 3 lots, so they had 75 feet.
Mhm.
But unless we know the existing lot sizes of what's here, we really don't have a lot to work on.
So the analysis was done using GIS, so it was using your maps to determine what are the existing lot widths and lot areas of the parcels that are in Homewood now. So that the existing lot widths, that was part of the analysis that was considered, and lowering those the minimum lot size.
Yes, but we're not aware of what the lot sizes are. So, there's maps at the end of this presentation. But they're so small, you really can't tell how big the lots are.
So the maps aren't meant to, and it's a series of maps, so it's not, it's a series. But the maps aren't meant to convey the lot size, but they're more so meant to illustrate. So the red parcels on the maps show parcel that would be non-conforming with the standard, either the existing standard or an alternative standard that's being tested. So the legend down at the bottom, it'll indicate whether what minimum standard is being tested, whether it's the lot area or the lot width requirement that's being tested, and then whether it's the existing requirement or an alternative.
It's a subtle way of affecting the density.
But it's ensuring that our standards that are in the code, our minimum requirements and our regulations reflect development that exists now. So this is density that you have currently, but the code requires less density or larger lots, wider lots than what you actually have here in Homewood today. So it's ensuring that your regulations reflect development that's on the ground now.
This is less than 70 feet. That's
So these are all different.
yeah.
These are-
Yeah, it's a series of maps showing all the different alternatives that were tested,
Right.
and then the existing standards as well.
Okay. That's all I have right now, I guess. Anybody else have anything?
Yeah, I've got a series of questions, and since we're just gonna go person by person. Um,
We go in section by section, article by article.
Thought we were, but apparently we're not.
Yeah.
Everybody was
Well,
jumping.
What are we doing?
Yeah, just
Well,
take
you already
whatever
did
you
it.
want.
Yeah, just whatever
Okay.
comments or questions you may have. Happy to-
Well, short-term rentals, I got a couple of quick comments and concerns about it.
Okay,
So short-term rentals, I have some experience with short-term rentals. I've stayed in some. In fact, real quick, my sister lives out of the country. I live in Ravislow. She came to visit for 2 weeks, found an Airbnb in Governor's Park, believe it or not. So walking distance to my house. And she and her family were able to stay for 2 weeks and not have to stay in a hotel in Matson or Tinley Park. So the concept of short-term rentals in residential neighborhoods, I think is a good thing, but obviously if you're the neighbor, there's gonna be some big concerns. And obviously we want to prevent the properties being used for party situations, et cetera. So one comment I had was, and I don't know if the zoning ordinance would be the place to put this, maybe there's a different ordinance in the village that would be more applicable, but to establish a complaint limit. So obviously if surrounding properties are complaining about a property and, 3 strikes, you're out, you're done, no more short-term use, is one idea. I'm also not a fan of the minimum maximum time limits. The problem is that hurts the ability for that property to actually function as a short-term use. Many, or like, for instance, people go and stop and stay for a week or even just a long weekend to go visit family, and having the ability to find one of these properties instead of being in a hotel is a major use for these kinds of properties. And also for businesses, when they have people coming in, I know CN does this all the time. I've done it in construction industry where you've got a project that you've got to go to that's out of your home area. And if rentals aren't conveniently available to the site of the project, an Airbnb that you can sit in for a month or more is great. That solves your issue. So I'm wary of the time limits. I also made note in that section that I think we would probably want to see very heavy restrictions on, where did I write it down? Sorry. Things like maintenance of the property, upkeep, appearance, refuse removal, control of refuse, etc. Because the concept of having that the owner of the property has to have it as their primary residence they live in. How are you renting out your property for a week to somebody if you live there? That doesn't work.
Yeah.
So the concept is dead. You go move out while they move in. That doesn't make any sense. So most of these properties are by people that live in the area. That's not always true, but that is the majority that my experience has been anyway. But making the requirement about upkeep and garbage and even parking, and that helps trim down the possibility of parties. So if you're putting a pretty hard restriction on parking, if you violate that restriction, your neighbors call in, hey, these guys have 15 cars parked out in front of this house, you're done. So if we could look at ways of doing that, and I'm sure there's all kinds of legal issues surrounding that, but that was my thoughts on short term.
so the majority of those concerns would be addressed by the village's nuisance code.
Okay.
Some of the outside of. the
That's kind of what I thought.
ordinance.
It might not be here, might not be the appropriate place.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay,
The minimum and maximum duration of stay, you're right, it's definitely a balance, right? We want to prevent the party house, but we don't want to prevent the grandparents from staying in the house, down the street from the kids. So wanting to find that effective balance of minimum number of days, so we are ensuring that the neighbors have some certainty and who their neighbors are.
right.
And then having the having it be the owner occupied residence. You see that quite often if it's a single room rental or an accessory dwelling unit rental or something like that. But that would ensure that there is, it helps to ensure that you don't have properties bought up just for these types of short-term rentals, to ensure that there is a stock of housing available for residents that want to live here and make Homewood their home, instead of just having sort of a hotel next door.
Great.
Yeah, that's gonna be a tough one.
So those were my concerns on short-term use. Anybody else got anything on that?
Well, there seems to be connection between, potential connection between short-term rentals and these accessory dwelling units.
Potential.
So, and I just, it just occurred to me, so I haven't thought this through, but what you're proposing for our accessory dwelling unit section under the new standards would require the owner of the property to occupy one of the units, right? But again, it didn't strike me that either in definitions or whatever, this accessory dwelling unit, there should be some, I guess, statement of purpose. Why is one creating an accessory dwelling unit? Is it for the short-term rental or is it for the convenience of family? So, and I'm thinking out loud here, so.
The village can restrict the occupancy of an accessory dwelling unit to a short or a long-term rental. You could say we're required, if you're going to rent out your ADU, minimum of 12 months, something like that. But it gets into some hot water. We're trying to require a family member to be the occupant of the accessory dwelling unit. Trying to define family is really a difficult thing to do. So I would advise against requiring a familial relation between the person occupying the accessory dwelling unit and the one occupying the primary dwelling unit. But the village is able to restrict the length of the rental, so that if you have an accessory dwelling unit, you have a minimum of a certain number of months, 6 months, 12 months for that space, so that it isn't used as a short-term rental.
So, but then therefore, it seems like the only reason for an accessory dwelling unit would be for the short-term rental market.
I don't think that's accurate. Many people would, they're called granny flats colloquially.
Of course,
So it would be, a mother-in-law suite is another term for it.
Mhm.
Just because the village isn't able to restrict accessory dwelling units to a family member, that doesn't mean people won't be using those spaces for those purposes. A lot of accessory dwelling units now are used for adult children who move back home to have that separation, have that additional space. I know my mom, she lives in Kansas. When we buy a place, she better have an extra room for me because I'm staying in the summers with ya. So we definitely want an accessory dwelling unit, so she's not, just in the guest room all summer, so.
Mike, I saw that also in another use. I had a tax professional that had a accessory dwelling unit behind their house, and that was his office.
Right.
So work, tax attorneys,
Right.
et cetera. But I could see that could also proliferate down into needing to control again salons.
Right.
We've had people up here applying for being able to operate a salon out of their house, and now if you have the accessory dwelling unit, how do we where do you need to draw the line on that?
That is a very valid concern.
Or
So
do we?
Dwelling is something we can define, right? That's a living space. It's not a commercial space, it's not a working space. If the village wants to consider accessory commercial units, some communities are considering doing that, especially in more dense residential areas near downtowns. But your home occupation standards would definitely limit the ability to have a salon or any type of business like that out of an accessory dwelling unit.
I think we're in this section. Would there be in the, I don't know if it would be in this particular section or your section on procedure 7, is there a mechanism for keeping track of these ADUs?
So we are proposing that if the accessory dwelling unit is located within the principal building, that could be done as of right. We could potentially move that to a limited use if the village wants to track the number of accessory dwelling units that are being built in the village. So through that limited use process, it would just sort of be check, you meet all of the standards, but you don't have to go in front of you all, you don't have to go in front of the village board for approval. But if it's in an accessory building, in a detached accessory building on the lot, we're proposing that require a special use permit, just because it could have greater impacts. That would be another way of sort of recording the number of accessory dwelling units that are being built.
So by extension, because this gets into, to be honest, the other thing is where we already have the existing 2 or 3 flats. And for me, it brings up the whole idea of keeping track of this. And I know some people cringe at the thought of that, but I mean, we all can, probably, we all have, we can walk down the street and point out 2 flat in an R1 or an R2 district. But the point is that I don't think that there's this overview of where these might be. So going back to that multifamily, using that multifamily unit as the way to anchor this. When you talk about allowing that as of the date of the adoption, how would we know? Are we gonna do some sort of inventory?
So that is one option, doing an inventory. Requiring registration is another one. So that would put the onus on the property owner to come to the village and say, we've been here since before the adoption of the code. Let us be a permitted use, let us be recognized as existing.
And if they fail to self-register, that's.
I think there could be an ability if they have some sort of proof later after the adoption of the code to prove that they've been in the village since, you know, if it's a deed or some sort of historic record to show when they were built. And that's definitely something that you all could consider. But I think encouraging that registration is really important and ensuring that you do have that accurate record.
Apply that registration to the short-term rentals as well.
Right. Yeah.
Something similar.
Inventory, right.
Yeah.
I have some other questions for other sections, but if somebody else has comments on this topic. Then I'll jump in.
Jump in.
If it's all right.
Yeah.
This would, going back just a little bit, where you brought up the concept of the limited uses. Just for clarification, could you offer some examples here of what you envision falling into that category, please?
Yes, of course. So one of the uses we're proposing to be considered a limited use would be those personal service uses and professional office uses when they occupy the ground floor in your B1 district. So that would ensure that there's an additional level of review to ensure they're meeting all of the standards, and also act as sort of a disincentive to locating additional uses like that on the ground floor and incentivizing their location on upper floors to try and preserve some of that ground floor space for uses that generate a little bit more foot traffic, contribute more to the vibrancy of the downtown, things like restaurants, retail establishments, entertainment venues, that type of thing.
So what about, because I could think of a couple of office buildings at the very least in both the central business district and then some of our outlying business districts that are office buildings, and they have professional offices on the first floor. So these uses would have to, again, register for something like this, or because they're existing, you know, that's just benign neglect.
If it's an existing office building with an existing office use, and perhaps there are multiple types of offices that are within the office building, if the use is office and it's not changing from office, that wouldn't require any type of registration. If you have a vacant space downtown and a dentist office wants to move into the ground floor space, then that would trigger that limited use process.
Okay, so to summarize your answer to my question, the limited uses are ground floor business districts.
That's one of the uses that we're considering for limited use at this time. All of the uses that might be considered limited uses is something that we need to really sit down with Angela, sit down with you all and figure out, are there special uses that maybe don't need to go through that whole process, that we can kind of demote to a limited use so that people are able to do that more easily, but the village still has that level of review to ensure that they're compatible with the districts they're located in. So exactly which uses are going to be proposed to be limited uses, that's still up in the air. We wanted to bring the idea of limited uses in front of you all to see if there's an appetite for maybe loosening the restrictions on certain uses and allowing an administrative level of review rather than a level of review from this body.
Okay.
Okay, if,
Most of the uses that I think we're talking about proposing as limited uses are permitted right now. So at this
Right.
point, they're permitted, so it would be making it a little bit stricter, but not requiring a public hearing each time.
Okay, now, I like that way of clarifying it. Not to say yours was inadequate, but. Thanks.
And it's going to be different municipality by municipality, what level of review is appropriate. So that's something we still need to sort of suss out and determine.
I'm almost done, believe it or not. The next, this is for clarification.
I don't believe it.
No, I'm really. Examples of the distinction you make between the recreation and event spaces, indoor, outdoor, and size. I mean, I understand the size, but are you thinking size of the building, size of the lot?
Size of the lot.
Okay, and then could you maybe just throw out some examples to sort of illustrate, the principles of indoor space, outdoor space?
So the types of uses that would be indoor and outdoor, or the types of standards that would be applied to
The
it?
standards.
So for an outdoor use, we want to ensure that we have specific standards for noise, for hours of operation, perhaps, if we're in proximity to residential areas, that you don't have large crowds or music outdoor areas after a certain time period. There could be additional screening requirements or outbreak requirements for those outdoor types of uses. For indoor uses, really more so looking at allowing the different scales of uses differently. So looking at allowing things as a permanent use if they're smaller scale, and then a special use or a limited use if they're a larger scale.
So for instance, if somebody had a microbrewery,
That would be considered a restaurant, not a commercial business. So think more about like a Top Golf versus the small shop that helps you with your golf swing in a virtual way, right? You have like the virtual golf. So the impacts of the Top Golf versus the little shop with the indoor golf swing classes that's going to be a very different impact, so different scales, and it'd be that type of use rather
Whereas
than.
Topgolf is like a driving range.
yeah, I understand that, but so just coming back to it, restaurants that might have an outdoor space are still restaurants, not
Yes,
recreational event spaces.
Right.
Okay, that was part of that. Last section of my questions would pertain to uses and standards. You seen the one thing that that hit me in both a good way and a bad way with this presentation is that sometimes you would give examples of specific use standards and sometimes you didn't. So my question is, are we to expect the next time we meet that you'll have a more complete list of these?
so the next time we meet, you'll have the actual draft standards in front of you.
Okay,
So if we're proposing any new use standards or any revisions to your existing use standards, that's all content that you would be reviewing and discussing with us during the next meeting. So more detail to come.
okay, and then this gets into the word overlay between your Article 4 new standards and what would be Article 5 development standards. And you talk about in and out, the use of permeable pavement and whatever. So anyway, I have to admit, I have a certain bias. I'm an engineer, so just to bring that into it, but, and I had conversations with our village engineer about this, but there are certain what they call best practices for stormwater management, which include these days certain features like permeable pavement and bioswales and rain gardens and whatever. So, I would encourage maybe making a reference to that and allowing for Max's input, our village engineer's input, so that you're not limiting yourself to, in a particular case, just the use of permeable pavement. One other aspect of this, we had a deliberation not too long ago for, let me use the word Triumph Building, the southwest corner of Ridge and Martin. And I couldn't tell you how old that building was. And our downtown area first platted whenever 1855 with the railroad, blah, blah, blah. But my point is, in our discussion, the engineer was the developer's engineer was sort of dancing around the drainage issues. And it just struck me that, I was asking questions, of course, of it, but in that particular case, and many of the things that we're going to be reviewing perhaps in the not too distant future, like I'm going to use the reference to Bogarts. These are in the downtown, in a B zone, a business zone. Clearly, they're close to 100% impervious. The use is changing radically because the building's been demolished. It's going to be a total change, according to the new standards we have. But where I'm going with this finally is included in these best practices in the B zones, wherever they are, not just the central business district, but even in some of the outlying areas, to essentially require some sort of underground storage of the stormwater. The new commuter parking lot on the west side of the railroad, north of the station, was rebuilt over the past year and a half, and that's exactly what they did, to use that as an example. And that, by making this reference to these best practices, it captures a lot of the concerns that people were talking about, bioswales and rain gardens and
Yeah, so
whatever.
I think we'd be more than happy to work with the village engineer on writing those stormwater management standards. I forgot to mention the landscaping standards that we are proposing would be very compatible with stormwater management, on-site stormwater management.
Exactly.
So rain gardens, bioswales, all of that,
Right.
having those standards, maybe not necessarily require it. That's something for you all to let us know if that's something you want all of our parking lot landscaping to be, but ensuring that they have the option, if they want to manage their stormwater partially through their on-site landscaping, that we don't have standards that would conflict with that, and then would be
Absolutely.
Very compatible with that.
Absolutely, but I would still want to answer or make the point that this underground storage of stormwater is above and beyond or below
For sure.
whatever
I think
surface
having
landscaping could.
Standards in the code requiring that you manage all of your on-site stormwater or all of your stormwater on-site, and then working with the engineer to come up with what those calculations are, how big your underground storage tank needs to be, all of those things that don't necessarily need to live in the zoning code itself, that could live in a engineering criteria manual outside of it. But
Exactly.
establishing the requirement
Exactly.
in the code,
Yes.
I think it's definitely something we can look at doing.
Right, and then with regard to the landscaping, and this, I lied, this is truly my last question. You make the distinction between a landscaping and screening strip adjacent to a right of way. And then you seem to place the emphasis that the screening and landscaping requirements, I'm just reading, be greater for parking lots located between buildings and public rights of way. I get it. However, I would, and then if I finish the sentence, and lesser for parking lots located to the rear or interior side of buildings. I would actually say, I don't like that. And the reason I don't like that is, and I'm going to use the Bogarts situation as the good example. That is a oddly shaped lot that certainly has frontage on Dixie Highway. However, a significant part of its property, and I think this would be sort of typical of a lot of our B-zone properties, it abuts a residential area. So if we were to follow your, and I would say, in my experience and certainly my preference, I would say that the interface between a B zone and an R zone should have more landscaping and more screening.
Definitely. So I think the issue with the 4 different areas, I think it was on the screen. There we go. So the parking lot perimeter zone, that would be if it's adjacent to the right of way.
Yep.
If we have residential across the street, perhaps, if they're the parking lot's adjacent to the right of way, but across the street is residential, we could look at increasing the standard for that perimeter landscaping in those areas for sure. But if the residential is to the rear of the property, to the side of the property, that's where those transition zones would come into play. So you would have your transition area landscaping, and we typically would propose 4 different kind of levels of these transition areas, like A, B, C, and D. If you have commercial next to residential, industrial next to residential, your requirements for that transition area would be much higher than if you have a commercial next to commercial or commercial next to industrial. So the width of the transition zone, the width of the landscape area, the number of plants, the number of trees, whether you have a swale, all of that would be part of that transition zone rather than the parking lot landscaping.
Well, I'm glad I asked the question because it wasn't clear in your.
So those
We
would,
definitely clarify that language.
those would all be spelled out in the final document.
Yes, of course. And that will be something that will be presented to you all in the next workshop.
Correct me if I'm wrong, on the east side of that property, Bogart property, there's a grade difference. The residential is higher than the parking lot.
I
Yeah,
think you're right, yeah.
Yeah,
and that gets into the idea of stormwater management, coming back to that.
I have a couple of quick questions. I wanted to come back to that. Accessory dwelling unit, I found that sentence. The table shows that South Elgin and Park Forest each allow 1 ADU per principal dwelling unit on site, while Wilmette only allows 1 ADU per lot. What is the difference?
So I believe in Park Forest and South Elgin, there are options to have multiple principal dwelling units on a lot. So sort of like a cottage development type of, so you might have a sort of condos of single family homes on a single lot. It's a development type where you would have more than one, what would be considered a principal dwelling unit on a single lot. And they would be condoed out instead of subdivided.
Okay.
We're not proposing that here.
Second question, short-term rental. Is this, is there an intent here to speak to Airbnb?
Yes, Airbnb, VRBO, those would all be considered short-term rentals.
Okay. 2 and 3 flats in a single-family residence. I just want to go back over, I think we've discussed this some time ago. The language here is they are not legally permitted under the zoning ordinance. Well, what is the difference between not legally permitted and grandfather? At one point, they were legal.
Right, so they would be considered legally non-conforming, so they were legally established under the current zoning regulations they're not permitted. So based on the non-conformity standards of the village, they are not able to substantially rehabilitate the structure, because then they need to bring it into compliance with the current zoning district
Okay, the
requirements.
last
which
time
are
we
allowed.
discussed this, we discussed insurance as well
Right,
on those units, that they could not purchase.
they couldn't, right, that was the big concern.
Insurance, mortgages, those types of things, very difficult to invest in those properties if they're considered non-conforming. Because if something were to happen, if it were to burn down, then you couldn't rebuild it, so that would be difficult to.
Okay, further down in that paragraph, clarify. These properties cannot be substantially remodeled or rebuilt if destroyed. And then 2 lines down, it says, it is recommended that new categories be added to the I'm sorry. At the time of the adoption of new zoning ordinance as permitted uses, in order to allow for reinvestment in these properties. By the word properties, you're referring to the land, not the buildings, because it would seem to me that those two contradict each other. If they cannot be substantially remodeled or destroyed as a result of a fire, how can you allow for reinvestment in these properties?
That's what we're proposing change, right? So you currently are not able to reinvest in these properties because they're not permitted, they are legally non-conforming. We're proposing to bring them into conformity with the regulations that you can reinvest in them.
Okay,
That makes more sense.
Hmm?
That makes more sense.
yeah. it does. I have another, just an add-on, under professional office uses and personal service. None of the uses have additional standards to control for location, noise, or other issues or impacts. A while back, we had a vacant professional office. Second floor, I think it was. Of a building in the central business district. And there was a salon in there that did a lot of dyeing. And the odor from that wafted into other professional offices in the building.
Mhm.
So that was a problem. And there was great concern among the other tenants when that salon moved out as to what was coming into that suite. So that would not occur again. Would you be including language to include stuff like that?
We definitely can, yes. We can establish those new specific standards to ensure that we limit those external impacts outside of either the suite in the office building or the building itself. It's a standard.
Okay, is there any need for language for shared driveways? I think the last time we discussed this, there were about 11 left in the village, where there are 2 residences
Mhm.
and they share one driveway.
If that is something the village wants to allow going forward, then that's definitely something that we could draft regulations to accommodate.
Well, they
It's some-
exist right now, and we've had some discussion. It's been a while with regards to maintenance and other issues, when there was a change of ownership of, which is what triggered the last discussion of this, regarding the maintenance and other
Who's
issues.
responsible and, yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
Same
It's a
with the-
sticky wicket.
for sure. And having those agreements between property owners is essential, so that they have clarity as to who's responsible for what, how you can use the shared driveways. Yeah, so if that's something that the village is experiencing difficulty with, it's definitely something you can address in the code.
Okay, last question. The map that you distributed is this just a sample illustration in one area of the village? Or are these the only areas that are affected? In other words, are these, you don't have any yellow and red colorations in the rest of the village?
Because the R1 district, the yellow and red, those are the only parcels that are in the R1 district. So the red ones wouldn't conform to the proposed 8,500 square foot minimum. But all of the yellow parcels would.
There was another map where.
See, these are not, the point is, all of these maps, Bill,
They're all different.
they're all different. So what you have is just like a, yeah.
Yeah, you only have one.
Yeah, you only have one.
only have
So
one.
to answer some of your questions, they're actually in these other,
See, that goes by lot width and R1.
Okay,
So they're all actually different maps.
You need a big screen.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
To put them all
Yeah.
up, yeah.
thank you.
you're welcome.
No other questions at this time?
I have, again, I lied, a couple more. The first is where you brought up the regulation of residential driveways. And your picture is certainly a nice one and illustrative of, illustrative of the general situation, but the problem is that in our particular case, the lot width, the setback, and then also the, I'm gonna say the size of the attached garage all play a factor in this. That particular drawing is wonderful because it shows theoretically how a widening might occur. It's just that that almost looks like a two-car garage, and it also looks like, I mean, it's easy to say the garage is set back a little farther than the front face of the house. What we encounter quite a bit is, again, a narrower lot, single-car garage. And the front setback is maybe 25 feet, which is close, a little bit more than the length of a normal parking stall in a parking lot. So my point is, I think we need, in my opinion, need to maybe pay some more attention to how you phrase this or whatever, because essentially what we see is people are always trying to push that lot width, or I mean the driveway width at the lot line. And we also run up against imperviousness standards for a single family lot. So I'm just saying that you might want
For
to.
sure. There is language in the memo about recognizing that a lot of lots in the village might not be able to accommodate these types of
Right.
different elements. So having the flexibility in the code to allow for extensions to existing driveways, maybe looking at permeable pavers or other types of the ribbon driveways
Right.
perhaps, to allow people the flexibility and parking additional vehicles, but in a way that doesn't come into conflict with that impervious surface.
Right.
Mike, if I can dovetail on that a second. So the neighborhood that has the biggest issue with this is Southgate.
Right.
And a lot of them also, we run into problems where they want to take up the parkway too.
Right. Because
The driveway area, even with the increase in the apron, doesn't cut it. Because the garages are so dang small. So that's the problem area. And I'll just make a side note, ribbon driveways suck in the winter, so I don't suggest them.
Right. Good point.
And I know that from being the neighbor that had to clear one.
Yeah.
So,
My, you know,
Well, all that just suggests is that this issue will be back as it usually is
Yeah.
in front of us. So
Right.
oh, yeah.
There's no solution to it. So
And it can be.
Well, they're gonna
really
find a
tricky on those
solution.
Smaller lots to accommodate all the parking that people these days need. You know, those homes were built in a time where you didn't have 2 or 3 cars per
Right.
family, you had 1
Right.
car. And that's just a circumstance of when the village was developed. So trying to accommodate 3 cars on a lot that is built to accommodate 1,
Yeah,
it can be really difficult.
Mhm.
It's-
You end
it's
up with-
something-
a whole street with no front lawns.
right, right.
And I think that's something that the village needs to, we need to consider how we balance that.
Mhm.
And what do we want our neighborhoods to look like? Maybe I personally want to be able to park in my parkway, but if all my neighbors did it, would I like the appearance of my neighborhood? So how do we balance that And then how do we ensure that the character of neighborhoods isn't changed or deteriorated or diminished because everyone wants to park, 3 or 4 cars on a lot that was really built for one.
But in many of these cases, the parkway isn't exactly that wide either.
No, but we've had cases where people tried to get
I
increases to the
understand,
parkway.
But just to make.
And even
you
went ahead
aware
and
of
did the increase to
some
the
of
parkway.
these.
That was a variance application for the limo business.
Right,
Right.
yeah, that's what we're referring to. It occurred to me, this is on page 14, subletting of office space and change of use permitted. It just strikes me here that, I understand your emphasis or your advocacy of flexibility, and this certainly makes sense. But it almost, it started, and you're using the threshold of 20% as some sort of marker to justify further review or whatever. But my question is, it occurred to me that there could be cumulative effects of this incrementalism. And by that, I mean, the owner of the building could literally, without knocking down structural walls, of course, but start parceling out a space into smaller and smaller uses that are lower than the threshold here. And yet this incrementalism, when it accumulates, could have a far greater impact on all sorts of stuff, especially parking. So how do we address that?
So I think coming up with the right percentage is going to be important. So what is it in the village that we frequently see that we have difficulty with? So that's a number that's still in flux. 20% is something that we see typically, because that's sort of a usable percentage of space. And that could be maybe a different percentage based on the overall size of the building. If it's a smaller building, then you would have a higher threshold for the trigger. If it's a larger building, then you would have a lower threshold. Since that percentage of the square footage is going to be much more usable at the 20% range of, say, a 10,000 square foot building than a 1,000 square foot building.
Right.
So we could adjust that trigger based on the scale of the building, and that's that would be appropriate. We could look at different ways of scaling that so that the village has the proper level of review. And then for the incrementalism, I think we could perhaps look at overall within a certain time period, these types of changes. So if you're subletting more than certain percentage within a calendar year, then you have to come in front of the village to get that approved. But there's always going to be something that's going to slip by. The zoning code can't cover every instance. And I think we need to determine the proper level of review and what the village does need to see versus what the village doesn't want to see before it, so that we're balancing reinvestment and new business growth with ensuring that we have the right uses in the right buildings.
Yeah, all of that doesn't preclude the fact that the village is at the mercy of the individual subletting the
That's
space.
correct.
Well, we kind of had that discussion. We had a meeting during the afternoon on Tuesday or Wednesday, and fire chief. And I think Mr. Jackson was on the phone at the time, and Chris Cummings. They have an office space, like Chris has got an office space, a lawyer's office. And there are times where he will let somebody else come in there to use that room or that office for a residential closing.
So I think the short-term use, you're
So it's like,
giving a friend a favor.
maybe
you can
one
use
day
my
a month or
office space for a day a month. I think that
Yeah.
wouldn't fall under that level. It's more like we have a lease for this space in your building. This is our portion of the office. It's for us to use alone. I think that would be very different than saying, oh yeah, come on in and use my conference room for the day. I don't think the village would want us to approve every instance of that.
Okay.
Well, we had a situation within the past year, and this was not in the central business district, but it was a business zone where it wasn't exactly clear what the proposed size of the new space was gonna be. It was different than what the building was originally configured for. So immediately when we started adding up available parking spaces,
Is that right, Kenzie?
I mean, there was a deficiency, which then therefore meant the need for a parking variance. And the reason I bring this up as an example is so everybody can recall that, but it just struck me that this particular section could, I don't know what the right word would be, it would expose us to, I don't know, some sort of, it would expose us to, if we're not keeping, somebody needs to keep track of this. If we're not keeping track of this, we could suddenly find ourselves looking at a situation where there are, as I said, all these little incremental remodeling and repartitioning of spaces in a building, and then suddenly what might have been an adequate parking arrangement for the original building now, because it's a multiplicity of these smaller uses with their own ways of generating traffic, suddenly the parking lot is woefully inadequate, and we don't have a clue how this happened. I mean, we know there was this incremental stuff, but we had no way of mitigating or trying to prevent that kind of deficiency. So any thoughts?
I can speak to that. That's one of the issues actually that we were trying to address with this, because we currently have a process where any new business coming in has to apply for a business operation permit, but we don't always know when they're subletting because we don't have a process in place, and we usually find them at a fire inspection or something. So this would address that. Place so that didn't happen.
Last one we had to do that was the second floor remodeling
Right.
on the building in the central business district.
Well, that too,
And
exactly.
they came in as an applicant for other issues in the building, and I believe we asked for the building inspector to go out and check it
Right.
out.
Well, again, I'm not finding fault with anything here, but it's just to stimulate discussion so
It's the
that,
time to have that conversation and
Right.
kind of figure out all those details.
Well, these are all the things that, you know, we've seen in the past that come before us.
The whole point of tonight is to have these conversations.
and parking is certainly at a premium here.
It's all about permitting.
Yeah, right.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to move that we give the public a chance to comment and ask questions.
Yes, everybody done? Yes.
No, I had more, but I don't want to step on the public opportunity either, so I had two more, but if we're up against time.
All right, so we will now open it up to questions from the audience. We'll ask you to state your name, and if you want to tell us what community you live in, that's fine. You are limited to 3 minutes, please. And keep it on the subject at hand. Go ahead, please.
Great, so I'm working on NASPA. I just want to make sure everyone can still hear me clearly. and my best to enunciate.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for your patience with all our questions. My spouse and I live in the Southgate neighborhood, and our neighborhood is, the majority of it is chain link fences. So in specific reference to Article 5, the bottom of page 13, I know that there's like discouragement from establishing new chain link fences. My question, and I apologize if this is like uber specific, how would that work if, for example, we need to start making a repair, something along those lines, what routes we would have? So if the village moves forward with the prohibition of new chain link fences moving forward, then that would, your chain link fence would become legally non-conforming. So you could do minor repairs, even minor replacements. But if you were replacing the whole fence or the majority of the fence, then you would need to bring that into conformity with the new regulations. That wouldn't prevent you from maintaining fence or, fixing sections if they were to come into this.
Absolutely, thank you so much, because that's actually something that we've talked about since purchasing our home in October of last year. But it's like our house and there's 5 houses around us, it's all the same house. Isn't neighborly issues, so I appreciate your response, thank you.
Okay, dovetailing that comment, that was one of my points I wanted to finish on. I would not support prohibiting chain link fence, especially in backyards. I've got a lot 300 feet deep, my yard's fenced in. If we couldn't use chain link, I wouldn't have been able to fence it in. And it's just pure economics. Sorry.
Go ahead, please.
I have a couple of questions. My name is Arnett, and I live in Old Homewood, so on the street with all of the whole driveways. That was funny, because I feel like they're all right there. But it's not that. So what methods could be added to a zoning code that could prevent districts abutting each other or like creating buffer zones? Obviously, that's one of our main issues, is keeping residential from abutting manufacturing and industrial. So I'm going to talk about like the transition period, like areas. But is there anything that you can actually say in the code, hey, you can't put that next to this?
For sure. So the purpose and intent statement of the districts is going to be the most important thing in establishing what the district is for, right? So in the purpose and intent statement for the industrial districts, manufacturing districts, we established the purpose of these districts is that they're located far away from our residential areas. That's one way to ensure that if a new property were to come before the village to be rezoned, that's the justification to say, nope, that's not the purpose of this district. It's not meant to be in proximity to residential areas. So that purpose and intent statement is really essential in ensuring that if new properties are coming before the village to rezone into that district and they're adjacent to residential, that's going to be shut down. If the property is currently zoned industrial and it's adjacent to residential, then having those additional protections, the buffers, the transition areas, all of that, that's how we mitigate those conflicts.
That's very helpful. So obviously, golf courses are a hot topic around here, and right now they're zoned as public lands and open space. And I wonder with this new commercial assembly, are they going to be changing what they are?
What would be allowed in the public
Are they going to
lands
be called
district?
something else? Are they not going to be public lands and open space anymore? Are we going to rezone where golf courses are?
No, they would continue to be zoned in that public lands district. It would just be moving churches, schools, all of that into that public lands district as well. So that those existing uses wouldn't come into that legal non-conforming status if they are in commercial districts or in the business districts.
But it wouldn't like change those properties being commercial or business properties. Right.
Exactly.
And I have a question about the administrative review process, just kind of, so that would take things to Village Hall and not before this commission. And so that would also then omit this process, the public hearing and in kind of open meeting for that.
It would if we were taking special uses to the limited use. But it seems more like the village wants to make permitted uses, things that you could currently do without any level of review, and make those limited uses. Because they want to have an additional level of review, they don't necessarily need to go in front of the board and the public for it. So it wouldn't be taking things that currently require public comment and making them not require public comment. It would just be things that you could do as of right, requiring an additional level of review.
And I know that was my time, but I have one more just kind of suggestion or point about the short-term rentals.
Real quick.
Yeah, we see that there's value, and I think that members of the commission do too. But one of the things that I am concerned about is the density of the short-term rentals. Like we don't want to have an entire block where everything there is a short-term rental. So can something be added where if we are giving out permits for that, we say, oh, no, there's already the other walking, we can't have anymore.
Good
Because
point.
I think we don't wanna have both
That's really
those
good.
towns that nobody's there, and honestly, that's just not safe or community.
For sure, we can definitely look at separation requirements.
Thank you. Hello.
I wanted to talk on the prohibition of showing fences. I don't think it's a good idea. A lot of homeless residents are working class. and have to work with corporate fence. Like working families with multiple children.
Can you speak up a little bit, sir?
Sure, yeah, sorry. They don't have the money to put in these fences, and it shouldn't be restricted from life or pets and children. Enjoy the outdoors safely. And then I looked through the current zoning code and certain comments. Mike, I know last week you talked about accessory structures, and limiting them, but the current limit is one shed, greenhouse, playhouse, or gazebo. For me, that doesn't make a lot of sense. If we have a large yard, a lot of us are gardeners. Someone has like the largest gardening Facebook group in the area. So I have a greenhouse and I really would like to put in another one. Space for it, and I really think that people that want to utilize their property that will. And regarding design standards, currently turf grass is to be used to prevent runoff of water, but that honestly isn't making sense because the root system is only 3 inches deep. The root system of native plants, however, can be up to 10 feet deep and would help protect us from flooding waters. Native sedges, grasses, and wildflowers. I'd also encourage you to reach out to the Tower Lakes, Illinois Tower Lakes Improvement Association, to hear about their successes using native raised gardens to drastically reduce water. Seeking an recommendation on species. I know one. And then in that, with recommending native species, I think we should ban invasive species. We can't stand department stores from selling them, unfortunately. But I think we can limit their use. Talking like Japanese barberry, burning bush, winter creeper. Native species don't require watering. So I mean, that would reduce the cost. I know that we water our planters nearly every day. Regarding landscape buffers, between residential and manufacturing districts, I know we talked about not having them a lot, but currently the landscape buffer is only 10 feet. It's way too small. I also think that the parkway landscaping type requirement is too restrictive, only 18 inches. I'd like to be able to plant some shrubbery.
Thank you.
Hi, hello, my name is Rachel Smith. I'm a resident of Governor's Park. I'm gonna echo a few people here about the chain link fences and just throw out there that it's very Flossmoor Trump banning, like it's not cool. Let's not do that. It's really not. I understand that residential parkways aren't really owned by the homeowner, like I get the whole concept of that. But as a homeowner in Governor's Park and with the single driveways and there we go with more of that. I'm one of the houses that is on the dead end street, like I'm on the last driveway on my street. And I can't widen my driveway anymore because I bought up right next to a house that's in Ravislow. There's literally 12 feet between that house and my house. There's no expansion. So if we started to allow for special occasion variances such as a single parking spot in the parkway, doesn't have to be a solid surface. A gravel parking spot will do whatever, because I understand the need to get in there and be able to access whatever is underneath the parkway. But that would be very beneficial for a household like mine that has multiple vehicles, a narrow driveway, or gets plowed in by the snow plows and needs to get around it, because Might not be an issue for my truck, but my cruise isn't gonna clear that snow pile, so there's that. The extra space would really truly help. I think it's something to truly consider. I know Commissioner Bransky, you had said that the ribbon driveway is stuck in the winter, and gravel kind of does too, but once the snowpack happens, you're driving on the snowpack anyway, so what's there to worry about plowing up? Just these greener options are going to totally help families with these single driveways, and I think that that is something that needs to be considered. As far as the short-term rentals go, they are very beneficial for families that are either relocating to the area, that are trying to figure out, okay, do I want to live in this neighborhood? What's this place like? Awesome, let's go. My home burns down, I've got a short-term rental, I don't think any of my kids out of school, I don't have to figure all that out. So I definitely think that those are things that we need in our community, but I also agree with Liz that we don't want to have blocks on blocks on blocks. And as far as permitting goes for like a mother-in-law suite and things like that, if you're gonna rent that dwelling out, then I think that we need to apply obviously for a rental agreement or whatever license. But at the end of the day, if I'm just moving my grandma into it, I kind of like, we need to have something there, like that shouldn't be a taxable thing. My grandmother moving into my house should not be something that I have to pay for outside of my grandmother moving into my home. So I just, like, I don't know how those would be regulated, but I just wanted that to be stated as well.
Okay. Thank you.
To clarify my point on ribbon driveways, I just wouldn't require them, is what kind of what it was.
Oh, I was just saying. I grew up in a house that was, I happen to have talked to the gravel driveway in Michigan, so.
Hi, my name is Jenna Webler, and I am a resident of South Beach. So, I know I sent this email to the zoning board already for comment, but I was able to make it, so I just kind of wanted to make a quick statement and had just a few questions. I obviously reviewed the memo before I came here, and I listened to the presentation when I was here. And I really didn't see any of that verbiage to guarantee an industrial district that cannot abut to a residential district. So I'm glad to know that that is coming, because I know you mentioned that we'll have transitions, but 10 feet is just really not acceptable. And honestly, I don't think an industrial district should be next to a residential district regardless. I think this is a very important part of the zoning that needs to happen. I've also not seen a lot of update considerations making the zoning updates more eco-friendly and sustainable. And maybe this is just the beginning phases and it's going to be fleshed out more. And I'm looking forward to seeing that more. I think that's really, the residents have overwhelmingly asked for this on the survey. And so I just want to make sure that those adjustments are included in the update. I'm sure we can all agree that the residents spoke up and out and did a lot of research to stop this checking facility from coming here. I know I am one of those. I know more about trees and flood mitigation and absorption of carbon and bioswales that I never ever thought I would ever know in my entire life. Homewood residents care deeply for their community and they want it to grow. They want it to be an everlasting, amazing place for their children and their children's children, and making sure that these zoning code updates protect and maintain our green spaces is very important to me, but also a majority of the residents here. I'm here to ask to push for an environmental justice commission to work hand in hand with the zoning board commission. There are plenty of knowledgeable people willing to be able to make this happen for our future. I just really want to make sure that these 4 things are kind of addressed in this update, that an environmental commission is formed and that industrial districts cannot abut residential districts, that we protect and maintain our green spaces, and that we have more eco-friendly and sustainable development. I'm completely different now. I am one of those South Bay residents that has a parking issue, okay? So the whole driveway thing, this is really pretty, but this is not at all what can be done in my house. I have a 1 single car garage and a very tiny driveway. It's great in the winter because I don't have to really like snow blow anything. But I can't fit my car, my husband's car, and my daughter's gonna be 16.
your car. I really think that needs to be structured differently and looked at a lot better, because I am one that is pushing so we don't have to have a variance to enlarge our driveway. And I am one that wants the parkway able to be widened too. Sorry, that's me. So, thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to clarify quickly, the use of the parkway, since that is right of way, that would fall outside of the zoning ordinance. That would be a separate section of the municipal code that governs use of the public right of way.
Anybody else have any comment they would like to make? Sure, take your time.
I was glad to come today to find out what all been going on. Nice presentation, I appreciate Mr. Cap. I really thought that there would be more as far as green space, environment, things that would be specific. That brought some of those ideas up. So I surely hope it'll be in the next bunch of information. Because there's an awful lot home with it. There have lived in 50 years that we have seen green space go. We've seen Halsted Beaches, Carroll, look at Gattinsville Village. So you know, those kinds of issues will be seen.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I can go again.
I just had a quick question. Who updates the municipal code? Is that code for-
We're not doing the municipal code. We're just doing zoning. That's a whole different animal.
Zoning's enough.
Yeah.
Just trying to figure out who we need to go after.
Yeah.
Member Bransky, did you have something else you wanted to discuss?
Time allows, I had a couple quick points. The fence thing was one of them, so that kills one of them. Salons. I had a point about salons. Let me bring that up. Because it is, other than parking, the hot potato. So everybody knows we've got to be the capital of the south suburbs for salons and personal care. We're the most pampered community down here. And I'm a big believer that economics will vet this out eventually. I think we see a lot of applicants come in here looking to start a salon, because right now it's easy to get into, it's low capital investment, and low initial investment. You might even be working with some kind of entrepreneurial grant. But I think over the long run, the marketplace will eventually correct the overrun that we have, but that's down the road. So in the meantime, how do we control this over proliferation? And I don't have the exact answer, but I want to bring a point up about a caution. Because as I step back and look at this, you have to realize when you sit here meeting after meeting after meeting, we have a lot of minority entrepreneurs that come here looking to start these kinds of businesses. And I just want to caution ourselves to be very cognizant of how we go about resolving this issue, that we don't inadvertently establish some kind of institutional discrimination against one category of entrepreneurs that are trying to start a business. Nobody up here ever wants to tell somebody, sorry, go somewhere else. We don't want you to follow your entrepreneurial dream. But the reality is, I mean, yeah, it's almost a joke of how many salons we have. So you have to do something to balance the economics of the local economy. But I throw that caution out there. We got to look at how we do that and be careful we don't create a bigger mess that hurts one group of people. And then to dovetail on that, the co-working use section, I think, could really go a long way to help contain or control the salon problem. I think the co-working use could actually be aggressively pushed. There's a lot of facilities. I go to one, I get like cutting my hair. She's out in Tinley, and the whole building is suites And that's pretty, you know, whether it's hair, nails, whatever it is, lease a suite and it's all contained in the building. And so that's your co-working use right there. Of course, that's in an outlet building and a strip mall's a little separate standing. Whereas here in Homewood, that's limited. We're not gonna have that. It would be use that's in one of our existing buildings along in the business district. So it gets a little tougher to do that because of the limited space. And as was brought up in some of the other comments, you get, you know, smells going from business to business, et cetera. But something to really think about, that co-working portion could really work with the salon and personal care use portion to help push it in a different direction. That was my comments.
Thank you. Anybody else? Before we wrap it up for the night?
What about rezoning, sorry, about that now. What about rezoning, like in time, in certain areas of Homewood into TIF districts?
Get her name.
Can we get your name, please?
TIF districts.
No, your name.
Encourage, developers. Is there anything in the new zoning code that regulates TIF districts? Brady Farm. Sorry, Brady Farm. Yeah, I just want to know if there's anything in like the zoning code that.
So the establishment of TIF districts would be outside of the zoning ordinance. It's a whole other process that would be established. It's the use of the term district might be confusing, but a zoning district and a TIF district are very different things. So that would be outside of the zoning regulations.
Anybody else? If not, I will, Angela, do you have anything else with Jackie? Nope. Ruben?
Don't have anything to add at this point.
Okay. So I will then entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
I'll second it.
Motion by O'Brien, second by Cap. Roll call?
Member Alfonso?
Yes.
Member Francie?
Yes.
Member Cap?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. So our next meeting, folks, is going to be January 27th. If you have any other comments you would like to add, please go onto the village's website for questionnaire and include those so we make sure that we have everything covered. Okay, and thank you very much for your
Good points.
patience and your comments and everything, and everybody have a good evening. Thank you.
Okay.